Hello, botanists. Welcome back. Well, we're kind of making this transition in the course. We're starting to talk about diversity, all the different kinds of organisms that botanists can study. And before we get to our first lab tackling diversity this week, I wanted to cover a couple things to kind of just help us make sense of diversity, kind of think about how organisms are related to each other and what those relationships might be. So we're going to talk briefly about taxonomy today, the two major ways we can distinguish between different kinds of cells. And then we're also going to talk about mode of nutrition, because these are all going to be different ways that we make sense of diversity around us. Well, let me just share something really quick. So I wanted to share this. This is just a big view of diversity. And this is a little cladogram or phylogenetic tree. Those also help me make sense of diversity. If we look at this, right, there's one basal branch to the tree of life, and there are these three major lineages. You can see this one in blue right here, this one in kind of orange, and this one in green here. Well, one of the ways that we'll understand diversity is by thinking about taxonomy, which is really how we organize life. And this term taxonomy, which is kind of an obtuse term, I think. I don't think I really understood it until I was in college. Just refers to the science of naming and categorizing organisms. So it's how we put names on things, right? And how we categorize them. Currently, we try and do this based upon evolutionary history, how these organisms are related to each other. And really, what people do who do taxonomy is they build those phylogenetic trees or cladograms to see what organisms branch and diverge from each other and try and make taxonomy based upon that. Well, with taxonomy, there's something that we call the taxonomic hierarchy. And this is just the different names that we can apply to organisms. And we're going to see that this taxonomic hierarchy is going to be nested. And it really goes from sort of the most general to the most specific. And I'm just going to name the parts of the taxonomic hierarchy in order, and then we'll look at an example. So the largest, most inclusive piece of the taxonomic hierarchy is what we call the domain. This is followed by kingdom. So I'm sure you've heard of kingdoms of life, like kingdom plantae, kingdom fungi. Then we've got phylum. We'll be talking about what phyla, that's just the plural form of phylum, particular organisms belong in quite a bit. Then we've got class, order, family, genus, and finally species. And let's look at some examples here. All right, so here we see corn, right? We've seen corn leaves, we've seen corn stems. I don't know if we saw corn roots, but I know we've seen other parts of the corn plant body. We even saw corn in some of those prop roots that I brought in from my garden. And if we look right here, right, we can see all these things in the taxonomic hierarchy that I just listed. We see domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species. And then we see the specific terms that apply to corn. So we see that corn is in domain Eukarya, kingdom plantae, it's a plant. I think you knew that already. Phylum Anthophyta, this is the group of plants that include flowering plants, because corn is a flowering plant. Class Monocotyledone. Ooh, that should sound familiar, right? Corn is a monocot. Order Comelonilales, family Poaceae, that's the grass family. Genus Zea, and finally species maize. Well, let's look at another example. Here are the white button mushrooms that you can buy at the grocery store. They're also in domain Eukarya, where corn was. They're in a totally different kingdom, though. They're in kingdom fungi. We're going to study both fungi and plants in this course. They're in phylum Basidiomycota. A lot of the mushrooms that you're familiar with are going to be in there. Class Basidiomycetes, order Agaricales, family Agaricaceae, genus Agaricus, and finally species Agaricus bisporus. A great thing to do is to come up with your own little mnemonic device to remember the order of these taxonomic ranks in order. Like I remember dumb kids playing catch on freeways get smashed, or dumb King Philip came over for good soup. Right? You can make up different things. I know that I had to make up some sort of mnemonic device before I could actually remember these things in order. Well, let's just talk a little bit more about these species names. Species names are going to be binomial. If we look at this, bi means two, nomial means name, right? This just means that we're going to have a two-part name for species. And there's rules about how we write them and how they look. The two parts are always going to be the genus and the specific epithet. So I'm going to put genus plus specific epithet. And notice I capitalized genus. I did that because these words, we have rules about them just to make them easy to identify. Now, the genus name is always going to be capitalized. And both the genus and the specific epithet, right, both either must be italicized, say if you're typing and you can change the font and do things like that, or if you can't do that, underline. Italicized. So these are just rules to help us understand and recognize those species names when we see them. So like if we think about those button mushrooms, right? They're in Agaricus bisporus, right? Whereas Agaricus is the name of the genus. Notice I capitalize that. I'm also going to underline it because I can't write in italics. Bisporus is the specific epithet. Both of those I'm underlining just because that's an easier way for me. And so I think a good thing to get in the habit of is noticing when you see those species names, making sure that they're written properly. Because I'm always amazed when I look out there in the world, how often in say lay literature, if I'm reading newspaper articles or things from magazines or just blogs, how often they get this wrong. It's a very common mistake out there. All right, yeah, so this is going to be something that we're going to use to kind of understand organisms. We're going to understand where they fit into this taxonomic hierarchy and how they might be related to each other. Let's talk about another way that we're going to understand diversity and make one of these big distinctions between different forms of life. Well, one of the ways that we're going to understand different groups of organisms is based upon their basic cell type. And I mean way more basic than say those terms parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma that we talked about earlier in the semester, right? Those were specific to plants, understanding, the specialized cells we can find in plants. There's two basic cell types out there, and plants are a great example of one of them, right? They're a great example of eukaryotic cells. So I'm pretty sure I used this term earlier in the semester, but I want to just remind you of it. So eukaryotic cells like plant cells, are going to be these relatively large cells. And this is going to be in comparison to our other cell type. They're going to be these relatively large cells with nuclei and other membrane-bound organelles. So you know a lot about plant cells and anatomy, right? You've seen things like nuclei, you've seen chloroplast and chromoplast, and all these specialized structures, we can see them. That's sort of the hallmark of eukaryotic cells, all this internal compartmentalization. Well, there's one other basic cell type out there that isn't something that I talked about earlier in the semester, but might be something that you've heard about in other parts of your life. And so the other basic cell type that we see out there in life are what we call prokaryotic cells. And let's just think about word roots here, because I love word roots because they help me understand things, right? We've got eukaryotic up here. Eu means true, right? Whenever you see that prefix there, kary refers to that karyon, that nucleus. But these have the true karyon, the true nucleus. That helps me remember that the eukaryotic cells are going to be the ones that have nuclei. Pro means before, right? Before the karyon, before the nucleus. And so the hallmark of these prokaryotic cells is they're going to be smaller in comparison to eukaryotic cells, and they're going to lack nuclei. They're not going to have nuclei. Their DNA is going to be inside the cytoplasm, but it's not going to be packaged into a nucleus the way it is in plant cells. Yeah, and they're just not going to have nuclei and those other membrane-bound organelles. Well, we're not going to see a lot of prokaryotic cells in this course. Our focus is mainly going to be on eukaryotes. Let me just share a picture with you really quickly. All right, I made this slide just to kind of put prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells next to each other. And if we start over here, this is a picture that I've shown you before, right? This is a very high-powered microscope looking at a plant cell. And the reason I can tell that is because I can see this big nucleus right here, right? There's a nucleolus right there, those darker staining regions within the nucleus. I can see all these chloroplasts. I can see this big old vacuole. I can see all this internal compartmentalization. Well, this picture right here is of a prokaryotic cell. And this is also taken with a very high-powered microscope. And they're still going to have a cell wall on the outside of the cells. They're still going to have a plasma membrane and cytoplasm, but we aren't going to see that same degree of internal compartmentalization the way we saw in plants, which are a great example of a eukaryotic cell. Now, this last picture that we see up here, this is taken with a compound microscope similar to what we have in lab. And these are showing some of these beautiful photosynthetic prokaryotic cells. Notice we're not seeing chloroplast, right? Instead, those photosynthetic pigments are just inside the cell. Well, there's one final set of terms that I want to talk about to kind of just prepare us for diversity, prepare us for comparing organisms. One of the first things that we talk about when we start covering a new group of organisms is their mode of nutrition. And all this means, when you think about an organism's mode of nutrition, is really how they get their food. It's one of the most basic questions we can ask ourselves about an organism, and it's one of the ways we can understand diversity. Right, so it's how these things get their food. Okay. Now, some of the organisms that we're going to meet, like say plants that we've already learned so much about, are going to be what we call autotrophic. And again, let's think about these word roots. Auto means self, trophic means feeding. And so these autotrophic organisms are going to be self-feeders. And what that means is that they use photosynthesis to get their food. So plants, can go through photosynthesis and convert essentially that solar energy into the stored bonds inside sugar molecules. So we're going to see a lot of autotrophic organisms, right? Self-feeders that can make their own food through photosynthesis. We're also going to see some organisms that are what we call heterotrophic. Again, let's think about those word roots, right? Hetero means different, and trophic means feeding. So these are the other feeders. And these other feeders are going to have to eat other organisms or pieces of other organisms to get their food. And so we're going to meet fungi that do this, and some other creatures as well that are going to be heterotrophic, just like we are, right? That are going to have to ingest other organisms or pieces of them to get their food. Well, I want to give you one more term here, and it's one we don't see all that often, but it is something that we can find out there in diversity, and that's the term mixotrophic. And I hope when you see this word, you think mixture, because these are creatures that can do both, right? They can be self-feeders or other feeders, right? They can photosynthesize, or they can eat other creatures to get their food. And this is a great strategy because you're guaranteed to have more readily available food sources if you can do both, right? If you can both photosynthesize or ingest other creatures to get their food. All right, I'll leave it there for today.